Hi everyone! Since this Excalibur build was months in the making and a lot of footage, I thought I'd make a project recap video so you can see it all in its entirety. If you're wanting more detail about the methods, links are down below for parts 1, 2, and 3. I needed a master sword to mold and cast for this project. I bought a toy sword to use as the base and then modified it with craft foam and a thermoplastic called Warbler. Once I'm finished with all of the little details, the Warbler covers the handle, the hilt, and the pommel to give it a smooth surface to be able to be cast. Once this was all finished, I decided to do a 2-part silicone mold and cast the sword itself out of resin. I ended up needing 2 swords cast from resin because I need 2 equal halves split down the middle for a 2-part sand cast. Once the swords are sanded for blemishes, it was off to the belt sander to sand one side completely off. Then I made a simple mold box to hold the casting sand as it was formed for pouring molten aluminum into the negative space. Because I wanted to use as much of recycled materials as I could, I collected thousands of soda and beer cans to melt in my furnace. They're poured temporarily into muffin tins until they're ready to be melted for casting the sword. The sand is packed around the sword itself, and then it's removed so that I can pour the molten aluminum into the negative space. Once it's had some time to cool off, the sword is demolded and cleaned up of all of the flashing that's around the outside. It's also polished to give it a nice finish, but we're not through yet. The sword I'm modeling this after from the TV show Merlin is mostly gold except for the blade, so I hit it with a coat of spray paint. I also decided to do the coins in the same method. And then it was time to move on to phase 2 of the project, which is designing the box that houses the mechanical components that make the sword clamp work. It was a pretty simple box to make, just made from leftover scraps that I had lying around. Then, to provide friction to better hold the sword in place, I used some old upholstery foam attached to the hinged boards. Then I used a yoga mat and a resistance band to give it the best grip to keep anyone from pulling it out. These get attached to the hinged board inside the housing, then it was time to decide what to do for clamping the sword. My first idea was to use electromagnets made from an old microwave, but they ended up getting too hot for the system and I couldn't risk the whole thing getting set on fire, so that was a bust. I ended up using pneumatic compression pistons for this and it turned out so much better. The pneumatics barely use any battery life and it compresses the sword in with 120 pounds of force, so that works out much better. Now it was time for the electronics to tell the sword when to come out. I designed a box to house the electronic components with these coins that trip the sensor inside and count the coins as they come in, generating a random winner. Then it was time to move on to phase 3 of the project. I stuffed a bunch of plastic bags with newspaper to get the basic shape for the outside. Most of the outside of the rock is made with polystyrene plastic melted in acetone. This was a plus because I didn't have to use heat to melt it, and it makes a nice workable textured putty. After the base of the rock is wrapped with chicken wire, this putty gets transferred onto the top, but I had a little trouble with it sliming all over the place and not generally working for me. In my attempts to get it to work better, I tried to dry it out with a heat gun and was rewarded with the really cool texture, but it still wasn't strong enough, so I had to put other types of plastics underneath it to give it the structure and rigidity. HDPE and polypropylene plastics are first put onto the chicken wire and then the putty is molded over the top. Once the entire surface is covered, it's then time to move on to the painting. The surface of the rock was too porous to take the paint directly, so I watered down some wood glue and applied that first and then put the paint over the top of it. The whole rock is then sealed with a layer of Flex Seal to give it a moisture and weather-resistant barrier. After the base coat gray was added, it was then time to move on to the detail work since rocks don't stick to one color scheme. I started with this first layer of darker kind of pewter color. Then after the pewter was applied, I moved on to a brighter sterling silver to hit the highlights and bring them out further. Though these paints worked just fine as a base, they were a little bit too shiny and made the whole rock look like just a blob of molten aluminum. To combat that, I decided to add a weathering layer of dark brown paint. This gives a realistic look and makes it look like the rock was actually sitting outside for centuries, covered in dirt. But even after this layer, it was still just a little bit too shiny for my taste. I decided to go back in with a dark gray colored spray and just spray it on in different patterns and in different locations to give it kind of a haphazard look. After that, it was looking much better, but I still felt that it was kind of lacking a little bit of depth. I decided to go in with this creamed coffee cappuccino kind of color and then just hit the highlights and bring them out and make the rock look even more realistic. Then I decided to add a little bit of mossy looking detail around the bottom to make it look like moss had grown up the side. Once a couple of coats of clear matte finishing spray were applied, the project was finished.
Things always eat my money. I tell you what. How many silver coins do I gotta put in this thing? How many pieces? How many? Come on. Right, one more. One more.